Now, one of the biggest areas of contestation in contracts is what do the various terms in the contract actually mean? Parties may think they're talking about the same thing, but they may have different assumptions as to what the contractual terms actually entail and require. So the core terms have to be definite and certain. And courts will look both to the express terms of the contracts, and they will interpret the linguistic formulation that's used in the contract, but they will also look at the ongoing course of conduct of the parties. They will look at how the parties behaved. Did they behave in a way consistent with one interpretation or another? Have they been in contractual arrangements for many, many years and they've always been doing it a certain way? That sort of information. And they'll also look at trade usage. So if a particular term is generally interpreted a certain way in a given trade, and this contract is in that trade, then that contract will be interpreted and that term will be interpreted according to the customary usage among people who know that business. Now, courts also want to interpret contracts in general to make the contract valid and enforceable. So if a particular interpretation of the contract would make it invalid, courts will generally shy away from that kind of interpretation. They will also try to interpret contracts as a whole, so they will try to make the whole contract make sense and not interpret one provision in a way that makes another provision either superfluous or contradictory. They will generally give specific provisions in a contract more weight than general provisions. So if there's a general provision that says something like you should provide an adequate amount of water to service my farming needs, but then later in the contract it says you shall provide 55 gallons per hour, then the 55 gallons per hour term will govern rather than have a big debate about what counts as adequate. On the other hand, if there is no specific provision, then it may be that that all of the interpretation of contract will come down to what counts as adequate. But if there is a specific provision, it'll be given more weight. Also, terms that are negotiated explicitly by the parties will generally be given more weight than what is known as boilerplate language. And I'm sure you've all signed contract that has tons of boilerplate language in it. Could be a credit contract, could be an internet site that has terms of service that you have to click through and agree to, and it's got hundreds of terms that are just standardized. Those are boilerplate terms, and they are binding. But if there's an actual negotiation about certain terms, that will take precedence over whatever's in the forms of the boilerplate. And if there's an ambiguity in the contract, that ambiguity will generally be interpreted against whoever wrote it. So if I write a contract and it contains an ambiguity, you will be able to get your preferred interpretation because it's my fault that I wrote some terms that were ambiguous. Now, if a written contract is formed and it's deemed to be an integrated whole, this is the entire contract between us, then there is a doctrine known as the parole evidence rule. And that excludes either written or oral testimony that is designed to explain the contract or add extra terms to it. And the reason for that is relatively obvious. We don't trust that testimony. If two parties have a contract and the contract is valid and it sets forth all the relevant terms, and then I come in and later and say, yeah, well, I signed that contract, but we actually had a conversation 2 days later and we changed the terms a little bit and I have no proof of that, it's not surprising that courts would not allow that. So they call it the parole evidence rule. It's really misnamed because it's not parole means oral, but this doesn't only have to do with oral testimony. It could be written or oral, but if you're trying to explain a contract that is already a written whole, that's unreliable testimony and it won't be allowed. The only exception would be testimony to show somehow that there was an additional agreement or condition in existence, but then again, you would have to really do a lot to prove it. Now, contracts can be made subject to conditions, even in an event that's not certain to occur. So you can have what are called conditions precedent, meaning conditions that have already happened. Conditions concurrent, meaning I will enter into this contract if this happens, and at the same moment that this happens, that's when the contract is formed. Or there could be a condition subsequent, meaning on the basis of this promise, something else will happen at some point in the future. And so you can have conditions precedent, concurrent, and subsequent.